My name is Paul Wilford. I'm here at the Chase Center, and I'm delighted to introduce our three panelists who will be talking about leadership, law, and civic trust in crisis. We'll start with Andrew Goodhart, turn to Dimitri Rakias, and conclude with Cameron Kim. I should have given institutional affiliations as well. Sorry, that's Andrew from the University of Nebraska, Dimitri from Princeton University, and Cameron from Duke University. Thank you.
All right, well, thank you very much, and thanks everyone for coming out this afternoon. So I spend most of my time thinking about international politics, foreign policy, and conflict. And we're talking about civic trust and education and citizenship here, and so I want to connect those two things. And the way I want to do that is I want to talk a little bit about the stories that we tell ourselves about who we are as a country, who we are as a people, the role that we play in the world, and really importantly, the mobilizational capacity that it has when the American public believes the stories that we tell, okay? And I want to do that by talking about a survey that I'm in the process of fielding that tries to understand why certain segments of the American public are rejecting military service. And the guiding intuition here is that we're experiencing a kind of a rupture in the social compact about what military force is for, when to use it, and what the military can expect from the country that supports it. And this is coming at a moment that I think is particularly dangerous geopolitically. We have two great powers that the United States is competing against, one of which is often likened to the role of the Soviet Union during the Cold War, but in fact is considerably more powerful relative to the United States than the Soviet Union ever was, and is coming at a time not of bipolarity, but of tripolarity, particularly in the nuclear realm. And so we have this geopolitical space that's extraordinarily dangerous, more dangerous than any of us have seen in our lifetime, more dangerous than the historical analogs that we have readily at hand. And at the same time, we're seeing this weakening of support among core parts of the country that traditionally feed into the military. And so I want to understand that weakening. And so the title of the paper is called Breaking Faith: Military Civic Society Relations in an Era of Endless War. The first part of that breaking faith is again about this rupture of the social compact between the military and the society that fields it. The focus on military civic society relations is because it's sort of drawing inspiration from this observation that 70% of military recruits come from military families, right? It's a very, very small portion of the society that serves the military, and we know this, but what's less commonly known is that the vast majority of new recruits come from families that are already military families. This piece about the end or the age of endless war, what we're seeing after two generations fighting the same conflict is that many of those military families are opting out. They're saying to members of their family, don't do this, don't serve in the military anymore. And so we have this extraordinarily dangerous environment. We have an extraordinarily small percentage of the population that serves. That population is primarily, it's a martial family tradition. And within that pillar of support for US geopolitical power, the consensus is softening, right? So that's the area of focus. And my hypothesis is that what we're seeing is that those who make decisions about when and how to use military force, when to go to war, are considerably more cosmopolitan than the people they're sending into conflict. I think that's the root of the fundamental problem here, that you have a warrior class, effectively, I mean, forgive the term, but it's a warrior class, effectively, that has very nationalistic values. They have strong norms of citizenship and national identity. They're considerably less cosmopolitan than our national leadership, and they're starting to opt out because they sense a kind of loss of legitimacy in what they're being asked to do. Just to give a quick illustrative example, the vice president said, "I served my country honorably, and I saw when I went to Iraq that I had been lied to, that the promises of the foreign policy establishment of this country were a complete joke." He went on to focus on congressional support for Iraqi elections, right? He's recounting when members of Congress are standing around with their thumbs in the air with ink on them, right, to celebrate Iraqi elections. And then he goes on to talk about the waving of Ukrainian flags in the chambers on Congress. And he says, my compatriots here are focused on the well-being effect. I'm paraphrasing now what he said. He's effectively saying that his compatriots in the Congress were focused on the well-being of foreign countries to the detriment of the American public. And I think that's the underlying sentiment. So how does this show up in the data? So in FY22, the US Army had a 25% shortfall in its recruitment goals. In FY 2013, they were 10% short. This year, they met their recruiting goals 4 months early. And so we had this dramatic crisis of recruitment within the Army, right, starting in about 2018, right? 2022 was the worst that we saw. And now it's done this remarkable turnaround. And what folks point to is this really different kind of tone that the current administration is setting. And I think they're tapping into a certain set of expectations about what national service is about from the population that's turning around those recruiting figures. Secretary Hegseth talks about emphasis of a warrior ethos, focus on lethality. I think that's having an effect. This is surprising from the perspective of the existing literature. So traditionally, we view recruitment as a function largely of economic conditions out in the country and of the economic inducements that we offer new recruits. And certainly that plays a role. More recently, scholars have started to emphasize the cultural determinants of recruiting strategies, or recruiting success, rather. So Kevin Walston is a researcher at the University of California at Long Beach, and he has a survey fielded last year that emphasizes the importance of culture war issues. Right, so he focuses on things like the use of the military for what folks call social engineering projects. He finds that diversity, equity, and inclusion programs are not well liked among military veterans, particularly conservative veterans. Again, not wholly surprising. The military is a more conservative institution than the country writ large. But there's also a real and growing mistrust of military and political leaders among this population. Now, the upshot from Walston is that the economics of military service matter, but the culture war issue matters a lot too. I think that's correct, but I think he's missing what the military is used for. So it's not just about DEI programs in military service. It's not just about whether you have a trans person serving in uniform beside you, right? It's what you're sent off to do, right? And I think 2 generations of military vets have come back from Iraq and Afghanistan, or looked at Somalia, or looked at Libya, or looked at Syria, or looked at Yemen, or any number of conflicts, many of whom my students are completely unaware of, right? Because there have been so many over our lifetimes. And they say, where was the American interest here? Okay. And so where do I come in? So I'm taking a 2-pronged data approach to this. So I'm working with Brandon Buck from the Cato Institute, and we recently have gotten Army recruitment data over a period of about 26 years, from 2001 to 2025. We got it through FOIA from the United States Army. And it's extraordinarily difficult to parse out exactly what drives recruitment in these sorts of longitudinal data, right? So you can do a time series, but it's very, very noisy. There's a lot of things moving at once. And so our strategy going forward with this is to look at the differences between military and non-military counties. And so we identify major military institutions or installations across the country, and then take a geographic radius of about 25 miles out from those installations to see how the recruitment patterns vary in those places. And the intuition here, right, is that if you have a different kind of martial ethos, it should show up in these places, right? We know that enlistment rates are about twice the national average in these places. And so if you have a sort of a systematically different feeling toward military service, it should show up in these places. So more to follow there. The other piece, and the piece that I want to talk the most about here, while being cognizant of time, is a survey that I field online to U.S. Army veterans. Okay, so I'll describe what I do in that pilot survey. And the goal here really is to try to pick up indicators of a potentially broken social compact. I bring this up for a couple of reasons. One is to share the work that's ongoing. The other is to ask for your help. So I've fielded a pilot at this stage. I'm preparing for the full survey. And right now I'm not entirely satisfied with the data that I'm getting back. I'm not sure that I'm picking up the indicators of a social compact that I need. And so as people that think deeply about citizenship and the social compact, I would really welcome feedback here. But let me describe what I'm doing first. So I subset the survey is fielded to U.S. Army veterans, and I asked them about why they served in the armed forces, what they think the military is for. So I give them open, format to talk about, why they think the military is there, what we should be using it for. I ask if they think it's been misused, and then what that looks like for them. And then I ask them about their trust in leaders, both on the civilian and the military side. and then what makes them more or less likely to recommend military service to a family member, right? The preliminary findings match what Walston found in terms of the dissatisfaction with DEI policies and the distrust of civilian leaders, but they're not clearly getting at this issue of a loss of legitimacy or a social compact. And I think, candidly, the problem that I think I'm having is something akin to what a doctor would have if you walked into the examination room and said, well, do you have pneumonia? Well, I don't know, doc. You tell me, right? And so effectively what I need are questions about their temperature and to put them on a treadmill to see what I mean, I'm not a doctor here, right? But like, not that kind of doctor, right? So what are the sort of the physical manifestations of a broken social compact? So that's where the project is right now. That's sort of what I'm struggling with, and welcome your thoughts on it. Why does this matter? So I've previewed a little bit of this. I mentioned the risk of geopolitical competition. I think the best analogy for where we are today is with 1945, right? Unfortunately, this is a much more dangerous period that we're facing. Again, as I mentioned before, the People's Republic of China is far larger, far more powerful relative to the United States than the Soviet Union ever was. We're also facing two great power competitions simultaneously, something we've never had. And we're more entangled with the Chinese state than we ever were with the Soviets. That's true economically, which is well recognized. It's also true geographically. We had a relatively clean separation of the world, certainly after Yalta with the Soviet Union. We are deeply enmeshed directly in China's immediate region, creating a lot of prospect for military escalation and risk. This scenario, this situation will require extraordinary sacrifices from the American public. It's going to require the U.S. to be able to mobilize the energies and the productive capacity and the military service of its people. And at the current moment, we're seeing a real softening in that pillar of national support. So I will leave it there. I think I'm out of time. So thank you all.
Great. Well, thanks so much. Thanks to the good people here at OSU for putting this together and for everyone for coming out. So I'm just set a time here. All right. So according to a long tradition in Republican liberal political thinking, the hallmark of a free society or a free polity is the establishment of the rule of law instead of the rule of man. So that kind of formula, a government of law, not man, that goes all the way back in the Republican political traditions. We find it in Harrington, in the English Civil War, drawing on Aristotle. And then, of course, we find it in many of the great canonical texts of the American political and constitutional tradition. Probably most notably, it's in the Constitution of the State of Massachusetts that we shall have here a government of law and not of men. And that's written by John Adams, and that remains a touchstone of American jurisprudence to this day. So the idea of a government of law, not man, is not just about the impartial application of the laws. It's meant to pick out a much more capacious ideal about individual freedom and a permanent suspicion of arbitrary centralized power. So for instance, in the context of the Constitution of Massachusetts, that formula, a government of law, not man, is applied to the separation of powers. The thing that gives you a government of law, not man, is separating legislative from executive power. And so more broadly than just a matter of equality under the law or formal application of the law, which is a crucial feature of the rule of law, that Republican ideal, a government of law, reflects a deep-seated hostility to any form of concentrated power. It reflects a permanent suspicion that any concentrated power begets a kind of undue dependence, which is itself a source of unfreedom or political corruption. So the paper that I'm giving this talk from today is about the American progressives, roughly 1880 to 1920, and their critique of the ideal of the rule of law, not just in its narrow legalistic sense, but as a capacious ideal altogether. And the core point that I want to make is that for the American progressives, a constitutional and social fixation with the ideal of the rule of law produces a condition of what they call, what Woodrow Wilson calls, leaderless government. So they speak all the time of a kind of spiritual, political, institutional anarchy that afflicts America. Let me try to articulate the basic background of that critique by setting out the point of departure for the American progressives. And I'll do that with a quotation from Henry Adams. Henry Adams isn't exactly a progressive, though he's a lot closer, I think, than a lot of people think. But in general, he's capturing the spirit out of which these progressive arguments emerge. So this is from the final chapter of his famous autobiography, written in 1905. And Adams here is describing his experience upon returning to America from a long period in Europe. And here's what he says. The citizens were crying in every accent of anger and alarm that the new forces must at any cost be brought under control. Prosperity never before imagined, power never yet wielded by man, speed never reached by anything but a meteor, had made the world irritable, nervous, querulous, unreasonable, and afraid. All the nation was demanding new men, and all the new forces were demanding a new type of man. The new man seemed close at hand, for the old one had plainly reached the end of his strength, and his failure had become catastrophic. So the basic diagnosis we get there, and in all of the progressives, the contemporaneous progressive accounts, is a condition of bewilderment, obsolescence, and anarchy in American society. There's a palpable sense that the nation has unleashed extraordinary material social forces, has undergone unbelievable cultural, institutional transformations, and the old framework of government, the old political ideas are just woefully obsolete in the face of these manifest new challenges. Now, that's the point of departure for these progressives. And the key point to emphasize here is how the progressives are flipping or throwing out, you might think, of the traditional American language of political reform. So going back to Jefferson and Jackson, and then to the Mugwumps, the agrarian Democrats, the populists, the language of American political reform was always about the threat to individual liberty being posed by some new aristocratic element within society. So in the 1880s, that language is, that focus is on the new monopolies, for example, the language of a new money aristocracy that's emerged. And so it calls back to this old American idea of the rule of law, not man, an ideal of Jeffersonian independence and self-sufficiency, and it takes as the permanent threat to political liberty the rise of some new oligarchic force. What the progressives are trying to say in this period is that that is the wrong way to think about the threat to American liberty. It's not the case that there is some oligarchic interest out there that is responsible for the political problems. The problem instead, the diagnosis instead, is a kind of impotence in the face of these spectacular forces. So the critique instead, the critique is not of an elite leadership class that is abusing the people. The critique is of the absence of any form of leadership or any form of control over society. So here's Walter Lippmann, who's one of the great figures of the early progressive movement. His later views are complicated, but at this point, Lippmann is, without question, one of the great progressive writers. This is from his book, Drift and Mastery, which is a sort of, the title itself captures this progressive point of departure, that we're in a state of drift. And Lippmann says, without a tyrant to attack, an immature democracy is always somewhat bewildered. We have to face the fact in America that what thwarts the growth of our civilization is not the uncanny, malicious contrivance of the plutocracy, but the faltering method, the distracted soul, and the murky vision of what we call grandiloquently the will of the people. So as you see there, the recurring thought that we get from the progressives is that this basic American Jeffersonian commitment to the rule of law and suspicion to centralized power or any form of concentration of power, that has blinded us to the real problem. And instead, by doubling down on a commitment to the rule of law and a rejection of anything that looks like the rule of man, what we've done is fragmented power to such an extent that now we have leaderless government and a kind of anarchic society. So this paper is an attempt to broadly sketch progressive critiques of the rule of law across a number of domains. So I focus, for example, on their critique of the political institutional fragmentation of the constitutional system and the progressives' embrace of a powerful presidency, for example, as a way of establishing the rule of man, not law. And then I focus economically on their account of the sort of economic anarchy of the market. So the progressives are well known for pioneering antitrust politics, but it's really underappreciated the degree to which a number of progressives were great champions of monopoly power. So they thought that economic monopolies were a form of leadership and control in an otherwise anarchic market. So while there are disagreements among the progressive world about what's to be done about monopolies, but Lippmann and Herbert Croly, for example, two of the most prominent progressives, are extremely enthusiastic about economic monopolies because they think this has introduced a principle of order and leadership in the market that we've never before seen. Okay, so the paper is largely about those two domains, the constitutional problem of leaderless government and then the economic problem of a leaderless market. Just for maybe reasons of relevance to the conference, I want to focus on a third dimension of the progressive critique of anarchy. And that's their critique of leaderless public opinion. So you see this language all over the place in progressive sociologists and publicists. There's an insistence that American public opinion lacks any form of definite leadership. And so instead of having real public opinion or a real public will, what we have is just an aggregation of individual wills. Some of you might know the Rousseauian distinction between the will of all and the general will. Some progressives explicitly draw on that language to make sense of America. They say we don't really have a general will, we just have a bunch of partial individual wills. And so just as with the case of our political institutions and our economic institutions, what's needed is a principle of leadership within the formation of public opinion itself. Now, what's interesting about this is that when we think back about the progressives, we often emphasize their commitment to institutional reform. So the progressives gave us the direct election of the Senate. They were often champions of various forms of direct election, recall referenda initiative. Again, those issues, though we associate those with the progressives, those were very controversial policies within the progressive world. A number of progressives, including Lippmann, Croly, Woodrow Wilson, Charles Beard, big-name progressives, were quite critical of any element of direct democracy, in part because it would just further complicate the project of creating definite sources of leadership within society. But even setting that debate aside, all the progressives, even those who support these sorts of institutional reforms, think that the fundamental problem in America is not about institutions, but about the state of the American public. So here's Walter Lippmann again. The politics of Reconstruction require a nation vastly better educated, a nation freed from its slovenly ways of thinking, stimulated by wider interests, and jacked up constantly by the sharpest kind of criticism. It is puerile to say that institutions must be changed from top to bottom, and then assume that their victims are prepared to make the change. No amount of charters, direct primaries, or short ballots will make a democracy out of an illiterate people. It's kind of sharp language, and you see this paradox within the progressive movement. They have a commitment to much more popular control of society, and then they have a far more dismal assessment of the state of the people than you might think. So what is needed is a way of organizing and cultivating and forming public opinion. That's what the progressives insist on. And they take a number of approaches to thinking about this, but maybe the most interesting way of thinking about this problem that we get from progressives is a kind of developmental city soul analogy that a number of the progressives draw to make sense of the state of the American public. So they'll say things like this. When you're a child, you live under the force of external coercive limits on your freedom. You don't really understand, you don't really think about it, they're just impositions on your freedom that are put on you. Then as you grow through adolescence, you begin chafing at these external limits on your freedom. You start feeling an internal assertion of your liberty, of independence, and so you start resisting these external forms. When you enter your majority, when you become an adult, all of a sudden, these external coercive forms are lifted. You have freedom. But you're totally unprepared to make use of that freedom. So, think about college students. You are impulsive, you use your freedom for the pettiest or most tawdry personal reasons, there's no discipline to your life, you're sort of flailing about. What it means to become a mature adult is, while holding on to the freedom you've been given, to learn that you need to freely submit yourself to formative institutions that can turn you into a civilized human being. Okay, so I don't know if people accept that developmental account, but we get a version of that developmental account across a number of the progressives for the child becoming an adult. And so their way of thinking about America is that the 19th century was our period of adolescence. We still had all of these inherited limits on our freedom, and we were increasingly chafing against them. Some of you might know, Tocqueville has this famous description about the Cartesian mentality of the American people. The Americans are totally suspicious of all external authorities, and they insist that everything be justified for themselves. And that was the state of, especially the second half of the 19th century on the progressive account. Now, we've entered this age of adulthood. A lot of these formal restrictions have been limited. We are now feeling our power as a people in a way we never have before, but it's completely untutored and undirected power. So the nation at large is flailing about in the manner of a college student upon turning 18. And for this reason, the progressives are actually incredibly culturally conservative, often in their account of the state of American society. They'll say the manifest moral dysfunction of American society can be explained by this developmental program. So they'll say, we have increasing rates of divorce, we have declining birth rates, we have an epidemic of spoiled children. These spoiled children then become terrible parents. We've abandoned classical education. They lament the disappearance often of Latin and Greek education in schools and the kind of civilizational foundations that all those provide. And again, they attribute that to this stage of development where we have broken free of restrictions and are not yet prepared to submit ourselves to civilizing authorities. So here's, for example, what Charles Cooley says. Cooley is an American progressive sociologist. And this book from which this is taken, Social Organization, is a really wonderful book. The second half of it is in large part a commentary on Tocqueville, so it's worth taking a look at if you like Tocqueville, or even if not. So what Cooley says, people have to make up their own minds upon their duties as wives, husbands, mothers, and daughters, upon commercial obligation and citizenship, upon the universe, upon the nature and authority of God. Inevitably, many of us make a poor business of it. It is too much. It is as if each of us should sit down to invent a language for himself. That great traditions should rapidly go to pieces may be a necessary phase of evolution and a disguised blessing. But the present effect is largely distraction and demoralization. So again, welcomes this developmental story. It's good that we've gotten rid of these crude external coercive measures, explains our current state as a kind of dysfunction resulting from it, and the suggestion is, the prescription is, the submission to new forms of authority. Walter Lippmann says, this is actually in a comment on the women's movement, which is very interesting in itself, but Lippmann says, all reformers are learning that there is a great gap between the overthrow of authority and the creation of a substitute. That gap is called liberalism, a period of drift and doubt. We are in it today. So that's why these progressives, who are so often remembered for their strong democratic commitments, are also the most enthusiastic champions of a new natural aristocracy in American society, one that will come through universities, and one that will be tasked not just with the formulation of high-quality scientific public policy, but with the construction of a new kind of public, a public that's capable of exercising its powers as a democratic people. Thank you very much.
There we go. All right. So I am in a very different realm, unfortunately. So I'm going to try to do my best to give some foundation for sort of thinking about engineers as part of leadership and civics education. So I am an assistant professor of the practice in biomedical engineering at Duke. My background's actually as an RNA synthetic biologist, but I have since developed a lab focusing on biomedical engineering, education, and teaching research to really think about what are the practices that we really need to instill in forming our next generation of engineers to tackle the future problems that we have set out for us. And one of the things that we've thought about, or we're really starting to think about, is the role of leadership in these positions, thinking about how CEOs at numerous companies are, in fact, trained as engineers. There is something to be said about how that type of training does get there. However, through our research, we've been starting to really identify a lot of gaps in the current educational approaches that we are taking to form this next generation of leaders. And I would argue this is probably showing up in other domains as well, although I don't have that discipline-specific knowledge. And I think this also comes down to a consensus or a lack thereof of how we define leadership and the role of character formation in this important effort. And so a quote that kind of, I think, resonated with me and my research student that I'm presenting on behalf of, Nika Ilieva, from Jeffrey Russell and James Yao. They're both civil engineers, and they say that an engineer is hired for his or her technical skills, fired for poor people skills, and promoted for leadership and management skills. Now, I'm not sure how many of you in the room get to regularly converse with engineers. You might be saying to yourself, yep, that makes sense. But we would contend, as part of this, and this is a quote now from nearly 30 years ago, I'm going to say, as somebody who trained as an engineer and has been through this process, I can tell you, and I would sort of contend the question of why are we still not doing enough to really teach about these poor people skills and thinking about the role of leadership and management, informing not just the engineer, but also the citizen. And so we have some work to think about this, and I think a lot of it comes down to a lot of the norms that we see within engineering, both in the education exercise as well as in the industry side. So this project actually started after a conversation with my undergraduate student here, Nika, and I'll have her speak a little bit about sort of this concern that she has around the role of teaching leaders and even teaching about teamwork and elements of that in her experience.
Hello, my name is Nika, and I'm a rising senior in biomedical engineering here at Duke. I'd like to start this talk with a bit of a backstory. As we all know, engineering is a team-based sport, so a lot of team-based assignments are involved in the curriculum. My freshman year, I had a few rocky team experiences, but compared to the horror stories I've heard from my peers, I got off pretty lucky. Sophomore year came by, and my classmates are still sighing at the words group work in the syllabus. By junior year, I realized that a lot of these horror stories I've heard from freshman year are still continuing now. And I began to ask myself, why? Why do aspiring engineers dread team-based assignments, and why do so many teams continuously go wrong? This question came back to me in BME 260, which was taught by Dr. Kim, who is standing right in front of you. The course involved team reflections, and it made me think back to all those team stories I had collected over the years, and it suddenly hit me. I don't think engineering leadership is being taught effectively. I said these words in Dr. Kim's office, and that's how the project began.
I teach a course that's entitled Modeling Cellular and Molecular Systems, where we utilize a problem-based learning pedagogy that really requires students to engage with the ill-structured, uncomfortable nature of problem solving, the same problems that I believe everybody here in this room deals with in their research and in their practice. But we began to ask, how is such teaming taught? How is leadership taught, if at all? And what does that mean for the future generation of engineers? Building off of Aaron Seck's work at the University of Michigan, I know is really bad to say here, while there's also a game going on, so I apologize for that. We're building a little bit on her work called The Culture of Disengagement in Engineering Education, where she says, professional socialization in engineering education is the only institutionalized training where engineers are taught the profession's conception of their ethical and social responsibilities, and where students' future roles as professionals are explicitly defined to them. Society views engineers in a very particular way. Unlike many other degrees, engineer carries an identity and a sense of purpose. That is why we believe that leadership education becomes inseparable from the professional formation.
We currently live in a world where technology is constantly evolving and driving societal change, and engineers are largely responsible for this. With that in mind, engineers should be good leaders, but how do we train them as such? One problem that we encountered during our research is that leadership education in engineering lacks a consensus definition. In light of the impact engineers have on society, we propose that leadership ethics in all disciplines should be rooted in character development and public welfare.
This is a sentiment that's also echoed by the National Academies of Engineering. In 2004, they published their consensus study called The Engineer of 2020, Visions of Engineering in the New Century, which emphasized the need to raise suitable leaders to respond to the rapid evolution of technologies, those technologies that we are seeing come to light today, including generative AI, including gene editing, including machine learning, robotic automation that will alter how we work in this new phase. In preparation for this opportunity, engineers must understand the principles of leadership and be able to practice them in growing proportions as their careers advance. This is in fact enshrined in the accreditation body for engineering and technology programs called ABET and their student outcomes. Student outcome number 5 states that students will have an ability to function effectively on a team whose members together provide leadership, create a collaborative environment, establish goals, plan tasks, and meet objectives. Engineering programs also outline in their program educational objectives, or PEOs, that leadership, this is becoming a rising thing, and we're hoping, we're kind of in a work in progress with the paper that we have here, but we're hoping to sort of analyze all of the different engineering PEOs. But it says here, the mission of the Department of Biological Engineering at MIT is to educate the next generation of leaders and to generate and translate new knowledge in a new bioscience-based engineering. So again, we ask ourselves, what is the definition of engineering leadership? Now, unfortunately, I did not pack the index cards, and I was going to make you all do an activity. But I'll have you think about this for yourself, and we can revise it afterwards and think about it in the Q&A. But what is an engineering leader? And I kind of hope that we will get different answers around the room. Mainly just goes to the thesis that we couldn't find a consensus definition if we all can't agree in this room either. But I'd like for us to consider this, especially about engineers that maybe you know, maybe your own children, your own family members have become engineers, to think about how have they been formed as a leader. There are almost as many definitions of leadership as there are persons who have attempted to define the concept. A sentiment purported by Ralph Stogdill, who now I can at least say I referenced an Ohio State person, so I got Michigan, I got Ohio State, I got everybody covered. We're all happy, right? We believe that engineering leadership still is no exception. So we decided to begin a scoping analysis leveraging a Prisma-based approach, and I'll let Nika explain kind of the rough process.
I became interested in finding out whether articles that deal with engineering leadership actually define the concept within their own work. I ended up with 50 relevant articles and sorted each into 4 definition categories. Another point of interest became the coursework meant to teach leadership in light of ABET and other student outcomes. Over 150 articles on engineering leadership education were screened, and a final of 46 articles were categorized.
These are standard journals that are heavily used in the engineering education literature, including the American Society for Engineering Education, the European Journal for Engineering Education, and the Journal for Engineering Education.
The 4 categories that the data was sorted into were set of competencies, which are usually definitions that are a list of traits, so things like a leader is a good collaborator, problem solver, etc. Power and influence describe leadership through the impact they have on a team. The 4th category may look a bit confusing. These are articles which define leadership through separate data collection and or outright admit the absence of a definition. So an example of that would be an article stating, "We do not have a general definition, but we interviewed 6 college professors." The way that we interpret all this data is that there is no general definition of an engineering leader. Obviously, 20% of articles acknowledge the current lack of consensus. 40% of articles do not even give a definition, or the definition is very vague. When we have lists of competencies or power and influence, it is important to note that most of those definitions are not identical to each other when going from article to article, and therefore those categories represent entire spectrums of definitions rather than a consensus.
We have next steps to employ content and thematic analysis to build toward a more clear consensus, or to better acknowledge the lack of consensus found within these definitions that we identified through the literature. A key part that we've been exploring in my lab, the Beetle lab, is to look at curricular scaffolding and how competencies like leadership, computational thinking, and problem solving evolve over the 4 years of an engineering degree. From the nearly 50 reviewed articles, however, we noticed that the majority of leadership is introduced through first-year engineering design courses or in senior year capstone. So there appears to be a 2 to 3 year gap between receiving any form of leadership education. Further emphasized through sort of the technical social dualism that we see within the training of engineers, that sort of these middle years are just focused on, for lack of a better word, shoving a bunch of knowledge into students' heads. We also see a lot of programs that rely on specialized leadership courses or elective offerings, which may not be accessible to all students. And this is an important part, as credentialing plays an important role in many career advancement opportunities. And so the ability to receive these said credentials becomes a challenge for us to address here. We also see leadership programs emerging through industry training, which is available only within certain companies, online certificate programs, and leadership programs that are focused at minoritized or underrepresented groups, such as the Society for Women Engineers. These remain optional and often exclusive. We have some concerns about the external programs that arise, including programs developed by Lockheed Martin, Tektronix, Becton Dickinson, and Siemens. We sort of beg a little bit of a question here that first acknowledges that academia and industry recognize that industry recognizes that there is a gap in the leadership formation, and thus relies and, in a sense, necessitates the development of these programs. We do want to think, considering Aaron Seck's quote, should engineering leadership be defined by the corporate priorities here? We also acknowledge that many of these courses are high cost, and it is still even unclear to us, without paying the money, which I do not have enough money as a lab to do it, whether or not these are actually predicated on solid leadership frameworks that we believe could be broadly applicable in the use of engineering education. So we like to think in this project and in a course that I teach around engineering leadership, we like to think a lot about the role of public welfare, mentorship, and followership. Frameworks like authentic and servant leadership can provide a meaningful foundation to be used in engineering, but based on our current analysis, when nearly 40% do not reference any clear, defined definition of leadership, we begin to beg the question of what frameworks should in fact guide engineering leadership education to prepare us for a society that necessitates the need of this type of engineer, the one that's developing emergent technologies that we should be concerned about. What does the engineer of 2050 look like in this example? So in summary, we really do see this lack of definition and the need for systematic curricular integration. We also think that the stakes are pretty high as we look ahead to this future engineer and thinking about how do we balance the role of academia and industry as stakeholders in being able to form these engineers and these leaders. I'm involved in a couple of different projects at Duke regarding character formation through an initiative called the Pratt Character Forward Initiative, which allows us to begin thinking about the role of character formation and ethical integration, which is part of my research that I do, and thinking about how we actually teach these types of processes to our students in a scaffolded way. So with that, I just want to acknowledge a couple of my funding sources that play a role here, as well as my lab, the Beetle lab, that goes to all of our websites and all that fun stuff. And Nika needed to make sure that I put this slide to make sure that she knows that she's thankful for me being here. And I will pause there, and I believe I'm at 15:06. And so I think we leave the rest of the time for questions. Thank you.
Okay, I think we have a little bit of 15 minutes for questions. I'll walk around with the mic and you raise your hand. Start here.
It seems like one theme of all three presentations is the potential for disconnect between people who know something that gets them promoted to something on the one hand, and those people's ability to persuade the rest of the country that the rest of the country should listen to them or look up to them on the other hand. Foreign policy leadership with the progressives, it seems to cut both ways. Their critique of the old model presupposed that the leaderless model was not actually getting leaders who got done what the American public wanted to do. And on the other hand, the progressives' alternative model is more scary to the extent that they too could be disconnected elites whom the populace wouldn't trust. And then obviously with engineers, my question is just, what does each of the three of you think are the kind of experiences that professionals of one kind or another, foreign policy professionals, engineers, whatever, ought to have had at any point in their lives, preferably during those 4 college years that we're all focused on, but whatever it is, that make them better at winning the trust of their fellows, make them more likely to be the kind of people that are capable of winning the trust of their fellow citizens?
Well, just let me just talk about the progressives. I don't know. I have no worthy views to share about the actual content of that question. But one of the key points for the progressives about the problem of leaderless government, the problem of rule of law, is that when you complicate processes and you fragment authority to such an extent, nobody actually is responsible for governance. So you scatter power widely, and then genuinely nobody knows who is responsible for the outputs of policymaking. So the recurring progressive demand is for simplification. The goal is to simplify electoral procedures, to simplify the number of elected candidates, so that you clearly know who is responsible. And the idea is that creates proper accountability mechanisms. It allows candidates, or presidential candidates, for example, to run on real programs, to be able to deliver those programs when elected, and then to be held to account. So one feature, this is not about character formation for leaders. This is an institutional approach to knowing, what Woodrow Wilson says is, come election day, the nation needs to know which schoolboy needs the whipping. And that's their basic approach for accountability.
I'll try to be, I think my answer comes down to a lot of what we see right now in engineering education is this challenge of, I think this is in every discipline right now, it's the over-credentialization, and the fact that my students are not able to really get what I would argue is an important humanistic study. You know, I have data from the top 25 universities that show what percentage of them actually are taking social sciences and humanities courses, right? And I'm at Duke, I'm at a liberal arts institution, I do find the importance. I teach in research and ethics, so I find there's an importance as an engineer to speak and converse in a room of social scientists and humanists and all over the place. I think that what I see as an important part of that formation is to better integrate that. And what I have to do, or what I research, is integrating it into the classroom. We see this with leadership formation. I see this with ethical knowledges. I think that is something where this culture of disengagement that Aaron Seck talks a lot about really comes down to the fact that we are doing so much to shove just like every formula into an engineer's head without reminding them of why that formula exists or why it's useful. And I think that element would allow trainees in any field, I think this is brought writ large across STEM, period, to recognize that they are going to be a part of the civic process. I think that sometimes they forget that they are a part of the civic process. And I think it's important that if they want to be members of this society, they must participate in it and all of its uncertainties.
I think it's a terrific question. I think that in some ways the military has a unique problem in that, or let's say national leaders on military issues have a unique problem, and that they have different constituencies when they're justifying their foreign policy. They have to appeal to the broader public, and we typically, for at least the last 100 years, have framed American foreign policy in terms of the defense of liberty and democracy. I'll leave it to you to determine whether that was sort of a deep, motivating desire or a sort of, superficial legitimation rhetoric that's sort of overlaid on geopolitical advantage. I think it's probably a combination of the two. And so the leaders have to make the case to the public broadly, and that's typically the way they've done it. They also have to look in the eyes of family members who have lost their kids. And they have to look at them and tell them why this was worthwhile. And they use the same rhetoric, and people are checking out, right? They bought it in World War II. And even to some extent, I mean, the memory of how folks thought about World War II is considerably simpler than what it was at the time. There was actually a fair bit of heterogeneity about, whether World War II was worth fighting. And then we see that repeated over and over again. I mean, we're a country that fights almost continuously in the post-World War II era, right? Over and over again. And we don't have a narrative that resonates with those families anymore. And so I think a lot of it is about contact with those people, right? If you're a political leader and you don't know the folks or the families that serve in uniform, or you don't talk to them, or you don't live in those communities, I think a part of it is just taking seriously how they view the world. And I think it requires considerable humility.
Thank you very much for these talks. My question is also related, and it's actually not as strange to think about engineering in this context, because I think of what we often do, at least as a political theorist, is we're engaged in what philosophers might call conceptual engineering, where what we're trying to do is we're trying to figure out how best to use concepts. I mean, there's different ways to think about it, but I think of towards the common good should be our focus, and how best do we think of concepts, and how do we develop them in ways that can help guide other scholars and academics, as well as the public generally, towards better public action. And so I guess my question then is, how do we think about, if one of the roles of the humanities is a sort of project of collective conceptual engineering, where the question is, how do we think of let's say democracy or whatever, right? How do we think about and refocus this concept, not just trying to figure out what's the true definition of democracy, but instead what is the most useful for us to live together as a polity? How does leadership play a role in that? Because it's not simply within the example of the lab, it's also leadership within the broader academic and the repercussions. And so again, this is for the whole panel, I suppose. If you guys have any thoughts on that, I'd be really glad to hear them.
Well, I would just say I'm quite suspicious about conceptual engineering. I think it's often a problematic way, to use an empty term, for philosophers to think about what they are doing. I think it's much better for philosophers to be in the business of clarifying concepts than engineering them. But that notwithstanding, I'll just say something about the progressives that's relevant more generally, probably. The key point about leadership for the progressives, but according to a much older tradition, is that moral maxims are underdetermined. So it's not like you have a worked out moral theory and it spits out what you're supposed to do in every instance. The task of leadership or political rule, in a special case of leadership, is to render determinate through an act of a kind of interpretation what those moral considerations require. And so it's a danger of over-moralizing politics, in a sense, because you lose sense of the genuine indeterminacy before political leaders, and the vocation of the leader is to render concrete and specific something that is otherwise abstract and underdetermined.
To add on to that from an engineering education perspective, I think one of the things that our students in engineering can be uncomfortable with is the ambiguity, actually, which I think as a leader is difficult to wrestle with, right? I see this when I teach ethics to my students. There's this uncomfortability. They expect an answer to be put into a little box. It puts into a piece of gridded paper, and that therefore answers the questions to all of life. And I think that there's, as Annie mentioned, this notion of humility, and I'm working on a research project right now specifically focused on the role of humility in engineering, engineering education, but also engineering writ large. Hank Petrosky, he passed away a couple of years ago, professor of civil engineering and history. He wrote a book called To Engineer is Human, the role of failure in successful design. And I think that what often, I think this is maybe a critique of current higher education and the way of just current practices about, I don't want to say that we are, over coddling our students. I think it's fair to say that there is a decent amount of that, but I think it also leaves this element that everything's going to be clear and cut. I think leadership is, in fact, almost in some regard, can be the absence of that. So that can become really uncomfortable for students, that, especially as engineers who have been trained for 20 years to put everything into a box, make sure that the units are correct and they have the right figures. So I think that that's something that has to also be addressed in this context, and being able to almost in some regard have to add in some of the political elements of engineering, because I think engineering is arguably viewed, at least in engineering education, as apolitical or even potentially non-political. I would argue it's more viewed as apolitical.
Hi, I have some comments about the engineering paper for Kim and Andrew. Looking forward to talking with you afterwards. I think it'd be better one-on-one. But regarding leadership, and I have some views of this or knowledge of this from educational administration. And I'd say what we've learned in that field is that it's extremely hard, almost impossible, to validate models of effective leadership. There are some ways you can sort of get at that if you can watch principals switch schools and hold constant the students and stuff. But me trying to map that onto engineering would be even harder because a project is a discrete thing. And so at any rate, and the amount of research out there that has any estimate of leadership effectiveness is few and far between. So there's that. And so the alternative to that is not to say that our goal as a field is to identify how to be an effective leader and to create a model of that, but to how to make leaders knowledgeable about the things that matter in the leadership process. And so in educational administration, we end up teaching about all of the foundational knowledge that undergirds the leadership process. And then some people say, I want you to think about being an instructional leader, and that is my conception of your role as principal. But other people are coming at it with a different conception, right? So you could teach those serially, but I think even more important than teaching those serially is to teach all the foundational stuff. For engineering, that would include a long list of things, from the engineering method itself to the space in which you're working, the knowledge of that, and then to all of the organizational and human resource and interpersonal things. So those are some comments on that.
No, thank you for that. I appreciate it. I think as well, it's this element of systems thinking that plays an important role in, I mean, a lot of disciplines, not just engineering, but I think that that's actually an element that arguably we've been starting to think about. And I would say I take sort of systems thinking into systems systems theory and like thinking about the macro system, the micro system, the meso, like where do people exist? And I think it's the honest truth that I think we have just found as being the most important here is just reflection. I mean, for lack of a better word, being able to reflect on what does a leader look like, right? That's not a question that honestly a lot of times our students get asked. They're not necessarily looking at exemplars in engineering, right? Because they're looking at textbooks from, theories that have been put forth for the, or physical laws that have been put forth for, hundreds of years, if not millennia. And I think that what we've been seeing is from a pedagogical approach of being able to start to think about what does it look like. I agree. And I do actually, like with my grad students, think about like, hey, here's like different leadership frameworks and how you could potentially use them. But for my undergrads, that's too much. I really do want to think of what is the self, right? Since it's a character-driven and a character-motivated work, we kind of leverage a few different systems of character education from Michael Lamb and 7 Strategies, all the way to the Jubilee Framework, that allow us to really think about this. And ultimately, that sort of element of reflection plays an important role in going from that sort of extrinsic to that intrinsic motivation that we hope as a leader would be a helpful skill. So we are trying to think through that process. I can't say it's perfect. It's still very nascent, but I agree that I think teaching just here's a bunch of papers about leadership isn't going to be helpful. But I do think as a community, as engineers, considering some of the consensus studies, I trained as an engineer 15 years ago. I mean, this never came up.
I think doing a series of paper may be helpful, but not with the goal of identifying the best one.
Absolutely. Yeah.
Instead, thinking about it more of a craft approach.
Yes, absolutely.
Okay, I think we have time for one or maybe two more, quick.
Yeah, I'm a political theorist, but my dad and my grandpa are both construction engineers. I definitely thought of that when you were like, how much do you interact with engineers? I was like, wonder. But yeah, I guess this is mostly for the first speaker, but I guess anybody could comment on it. I'm curious if you have any thoughts about how changes in military technology have changed how the American public relates to the military, or to like the needs, or I guess I'm thinking too about, like, in a way it seems like the US is able to be involved militarily without really that much of the public being personally connected to someone who is in war. And I wonder how much that has to do with changes in technology, and I guess whether that creates less investment and when we're making these decisions about war. Yeah, thank you.
I think it's a great question. I don't have a fully thought out answer to it. I mean, right off the top, I mean, I think we were seeing some of these evolutions throughout the post-World War II era. You know, we have the shift to an all-volunteer force. I think it's the major watershed moment. I mean, that's the big change, right? Is we radically reduced the percentage of the population that serves in the military. But I think in the more sort of contemporary era, we've just lowered the cost, right? So it's like the cost even to the military community of breaking. I mean, I used to work for the Army as a civilian, and I remember a very salty Army officer, commented to me, "You know what we do here, boy?" He didn't say boy, but I'm sort of embellishing. He goes, "We break things and we kill people." And the costs for the United States of breaking things and killing people are pretty low right now. I think those costs are about to spike, right? And so technology doesn't solve this problem. I'm sort of like not exactly answering your question, but I think it's made it easier for a long time. We've lowered the barriers to fight. Those barriers are going back up, but the war is coming, is my prediction. Cost to us socially is going to be extraordinarily high.
Okay, on that note that the war is coming, let's thank our panel.